what branch of the military did you serve in, and why did you choose that particular branch?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, so that one's easy. I joined the Navy. I served in the Navy because it was. I watched this movie called Navy SEALs back in the '90s, and me and my best friend were like, we want to be demolition divers. So after watching that movie, we were set. The Navy was the place for us, and so that's what happened.
Well, that's nice. And so, did you become a demolition diver, or how did that work out?
I did not become a demolition diver. So eventually, what happened was that dream of being a demolition diver, it kind of went by the wayside for a while there because for a few years there I was kind of living on my own, living on the streets in high school. And then a friend of mine, he joined the Navy, and he came to me and said, hey, didn't you want to join the Navy? And I was like, yeah. And so he told me this on a Friday, I think it was, and then by Saturday I was on a bus up to MEPS to sign up for the Navy and do my physicals and stuff like that. And I took a test called the ASVAB, and I scored pretty high on it. And so from that, my recruiter said, hey, you should be a nuclear operator, which I didn't know what it was. I just thought, oh, nuclear sounds great. And so unfortunately, nuclear operators aren't allowed to be demolition divers. It doesn't. They spend a lot of the time on your education and on your training to then try to have you transition to another field. It's pretty challenging to do. So no, I didn't get to be a demolition diver, but that was okay because I live life as thinking like God always has a better plan for me.
So, and what was your basic training like? Like, was it hard? Was it easier than you thought?
From growing up playing football in Texas, I would say that it prepared me really well for boot camp because it was always about the grind, 2-a-days, things like that. I was early in my career, I was a really go-getter where I thought, I had these big dreams of what I was going to accomplish. I thought I was going to be the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy. And so going into boot camp, I was motivated. It was challenging. I was just telling the boys a story about what we call making it rain in boot camp. And it was kind of where we worked out so much that moisture started to run from the walls. So we did some pretty hard workouts back then. And but the challenge piece, it was challenging, but it was cool to see a bunch of people from all over the country come together for something bigger than themselves.
So what was like the transition from prior to military life into it? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, it's you kind of go from having the freedom to just do what you think is best for you, and now you're thinking about what's best for the Corps, what's best for the team, what's best for the other sailors on the ship, your shipmates, things like that. And so that transition was just a little bit different in the beginning because you start to, I think we are all kind of inherently selfish in our own ways. And so by joining the military, you kind of have to give up that idea of like, it's about me. And it comes and goes, but you're constantly reminded of that.
And so tell me about your time in the military. Like, do you have any stories? What was it like?
Yeah. So my story. I mean, if you're in the Navy, you probably, or especially nuclear power, you kind of understand that. Like, I had a very unusual or strange career in the sense that the opportunities I ended up having. So being a nuclear operator and working on submarines, most of the time our jobs are surrounded by that field, that constantly just working in the power plant. Deployments on subs, you're working at nuclear power training command, the schools and stuff like that, and then your career stays on that path till you retire, and that's basically it. And for me, I was blessed that I was on submarines for a few years. Funny thing is, submarines are voluntary, and through an admin snafu, I ended up being on a submarine before I volunteered. So. That was that was an interesting story. It ended up working out, and that's kind of where I say, like, I feel like God is always moving in certain scenarios, and he kind of put me where he needed me to be. And then I had through that time, I ended up being on on a submarine tender in Italy, and which allowed me to do humanitarian work in Africa. And that's probably one of the most memorable times I had in the Navy, and probably one of the most meaningful times, because you can see a direct impact on what you're doing for other nations, as opposed to when you're on a submarine, you're locked up in this tube for a long time, and you don't get to really see what you're doing, other than just trusting that the mission has a bigger purpose than you. And so so my time in the military was very unique like that. I mean, there were some challenging times, and some different, some periods that teach you some life lessons. And it's definitely, so there's some good times and some challenging times. But my career, eventually I was able to get a college degree, which in my family that didn't happen, So I think about, like, this kid that's living on the streets for years, joining the military, gave me that opportunity where I was able to ideally change the trajectory of my family and my family tree and what it would be like, because it got me an education, it taught me about service, and I ended up doing it for 24 years.
And then earlier you talked about going to Italy and Africa. So how many different places have you been to, and what were those traveling experiences like?
So I don't know the number, but I've lived in a lot of places. I mean, I've lived in Hawaii, Italy, Virginia, New York, Massachusetts. I've lived in Washington State. I'm in California now. Trey, my oldest son, he's pretty much moved schools every 2 years of his life. So that was that experience it's been neat, to be able to see the world. And you also, what I learned through that experience is that there's so much more out there than what's in front of me. Being able to see Africa and go to where there's the beginning of the world, in a lot of ways it became, and seeing those nations. And then I've been to, Thailand and Singapore, and to, there's other Australia, and you just kind of see the differences between America and these other nations. And then you also just see God's beauty is what I really like to think. When I look back, reflect on it, is I see a lot of that in those opportunities, and I see my kids had a chance to grow up and know that now they're not afraid to go out into the world. Yeah,
it's true. Tell me about your most stressful or challenging time in the military.
So I would say my most challenging time in the military probably was my first submarine that I was on. There was some, there's some things I'd probably rather not say, but that time, it was really challenging, just trying to overcome some differences that I may have had with culture and direction, and just there was a lot to it that I ultimately learned some lessons about myself from it. I learned that one, that everything isn't about me. I mean, I think when you join the military and you're competitive, you play sports, and you join this team, you always have this team sport, but the whole idea still is to be the best, right? I mean, you play basketball, so you get you're on this team sport, you want the team to do well, but you also want to do well personally. So you're constantly competing to be the best, hopefully. And I think sometimes in that process of trying to be the best, sometimes we subconsciously make everything about us. And I think when we do make it about us, we lose sight of what service really is. And I think on my first submarine, because I was facing so many challenges, I had this dream of being the best, but then I was facing a lot of different roadblocks throughout that process. Plus it was during, my first deployment was during 9/11. I was deployed when that happened, and then, Iraq free. All right, and that really changed the op tempo of the submarine community, because we're constantly in and out. We're doing a lot of deployments, a lot of underways, and so the stress of that plus this idea that I was trying to reach what I thought was greatness in myself. And I was, at the time, felt like it was for the team. I eventually realized that it was really about me. I was like making it about me, which is an important lesson for me to learn in the military, and as a Christian, that it's not about it's about what I can do for others, not what they can do for me. And that and my desire to reach greatness, or what I thought was greatness, should have been so that I could do more for those that are surrounding me, not so I can do more for me and I can make my own self glorify myself. So I know I didn't really give you a lot of detail into what happened, but I just would say that was probably the most challenging duty station I had in my career. And there were some difficult times and ups and downs, but that's part of why we serve and do what we do.
Tell me about like some of your awards and what you prize the most.
The most rewarding thing was when my sailors have come back to me and said, "Hey, sir, before I met you, I was going down a very dark place, and through our relationship and how we worked together and how you took the time to make sure I understood that it was about, you cared more about me than worrying about, how I wrote a report at this, and it changed my life. And because of that, I'm no longer going down this dark path that I was going down." And so to me, the awards, they're all fleeting. They all fade away. I think Solomon talks about, he did all these works. He had all these in Ecclesiastes. He did all this stuff, and it was all for nothing. It was all fleeting. And that's kind of how I look at the awards. The awards are great, and I appreciate the recognition. But at the end of the day, the awards are going to disappear with the rest of with everything else, because it's on temporary. But those relationships that I had with these other people, now that was the most rewarding piece.
And then this is kind of a moving forward question, but I know you just recently retired. So how has your transition been from military life to now retirement? Yeah, so so my retirement speech was all about that, like identity, because I joined the Navy 2 weeks out of high school. So I graduated from high school. I think it was June 1st or something around that time frame, and I was at boot camp on June 17th. Oh. Right, so from 18 to now, all I've ever known is putting this uniform on every day and putting a uniform on, and that's who I was, right? I look in the mirror, and I could be proud of that, right? I could be proud that I was, I would often find myself like just looking in the mirror and thinking that, like, this is the blessing, right? Like, I get to wear this uniform for which I believe is a great nation that's worth defending, and it's worth defending the freedoms of everyone around me, and it's worth the sacrifice, and there's honor in that, and it just, when people would say thank you for your service, at some points it got to the point where I'm just like, hey, you're welcome, like it wasn't a big deal, because I felt that's what we're called to do, is serve. But I think it does become part of your identity. So you have a hard time seeing yourself, like, who am I when people aren't saying thank you for your service? Like, am I still worthy, right? And so that's been something that I have been working through as I transitioned from the military, is understanding that the uniform didn't define me. Right, it was just a conduit for God, that He was doing a good work in me, and that my identity was found in Christ. But it doesn't make it easier, I would say, when you no longer get to wear the uniform every day, because you wear it. 300 days a year at least, if not more. You're wearing the same articles of clothing that identify you as. You're in the military, you serve. So, so for more than half of my life and all of my adult life, I've always been in the military. And so, as I transition, I'm just navigating that identity piece. Whereas that did the uniform define me and drive me to try to make better choices, or try to serve others, or to be
be someone who, who cares about a bigger picture, bigger than yourself. And I think people talk about the military. I mean, there's so many guys out there who did way more than I could ever imagine doing. Like a lot of times, even doing this interview, I think to myself, like, I'm not worthy to really do this interview because I have friends that I know who've sacrificed way more on the combat, in combat, that have seen way more and lost way more than I have. Um, you know, but I'm still grateful for that, for doing that piece, because, and I have to pull back from that identity piece, because I know that everyone, and there's only 1 to 2% of the people who serve in the military. So you think about that, right? 1 to 2%. And I used to always tell my sailors, of that 1 to 2% that serve, that means that we give up a little bit of our rights for the rights of everybody else, right? So we don't have a lot of same freedoms that everyone does, because we're doing the mission, we're committed to our contracts, our time to serve, so other people can have the freedom to. Someone was asking me about what I feel about people burning the flag or doing things like that, or doing things that are counter to what I believe in.
Mm-hmm.
But we serve so people can have rights to have the freedoms to do what they want to do in America, and within reason, right?
Yeah.
Because we're a democracy, and we fight for. I don't have to agree with what they're doing, but we all serve for a greater meaning. Everyone has to do their piece, right? The guy who, let's say, you're an IT guy and your job is to make sure all the computers work. You're serving because if you don't do your piece, then the message can't get to the special operators out in the field, right?
Mm-hmm.
So everyone does their piece. But anyhow, so the identity is the part that I'm just trying to figure out, man.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful that I have something that other people don't.